At the end of 2023, I made the decision that I was only going to shoot with prime lenses for the entire year of 2024. Now, there were a few exceptions when it came to video, but for the most part, I was committed, I was dedicated, and I used only primes for the entire year. I ended up learning a lot, and overall, I do feel like it made me a better photographer in the long run. So that's what this video is going to be about today, is zooms versus primes. What's the advantages, disadvantages, is one better than the other? And what I've come to find out is really there's no wrong answer when you're asking these questions. But last video, I started a series on camera basics, and we're going to take it all the way to expert level tips and tricks. So this is episode 2 in that series. If you're new here, my name is Donnie B. I make photo and tech related content. So if that sounds like that's something you're into, then do us both a favor and hit that subscribe button. If you're not new here, then I appreciate you coming back, and it's good to see you again. All right, first off, let's address the elephant in the room. Let's talk about this 85mm 1.8. And I know what you're thinking. Donnie, that's not an 85mm. That's a can of beans. And you'd be right. But my daughter borrowed my 85 a couple weeks ago, and she has not returned it yet. So that's just testament to how good that lens really is, right? All right, so zoom lenses, prime lenses, what do these terms even mean? Well, it actually is exactly what it sounds like. It is a lens that will change its focal length depending on whether you zoom the lens in or out. And there's two types of zoom lenses. You have a fixed aperture, which is either an f4 or an f2.8, and then you have a variable aperture like this 100 to 400. This lens will cover 100 millimeters all the way to 400 millimeters, but the aperture will change as you zoom in. So this is a f4 to f6.3 versus a fixed aperture lens that will be something like this f4 or this f2.8. The good thing about a lens that's a constant aperture, meaning it stays the same aperture all the way throughout. And whenever I say an f4 or f2.8, it does not mean that's the only aperture it has. You can still stop down these lenses. They usually go all the way to f16 or f22, or some of them I think even go to like f32. So the widest aperture is that f-stop. So this is an f4, and then say this 70 to 200 is a 2.8. That means its maximum aperture, the widest it will open up to, is an f4 or f2.8. Now the benefit to that is as you zoom in and out, your exposure will not change. So if you have your exposure dialed in and you're at 50 millimeters and you want to punch into 70, then you won't have to change your shutter speed or ISO to accommodate that change. Now with a variable aperture lens, say the 100 to 400, if I'm at 300 millimeters and I want to punch into 400 millimeters, when I do that, the aperture is going to stop down and I will have to adjust my exposure to compensate, which can be a bit tedious. And at the end of my last video, I talked about how aperture is one of the most expensive elements when it comes to photography, and I still stand by that. But I also said that the biggest thing you can do to improve your photography is to invest in good glass. So get away from the kit lenses. It's okay to use a variable aperture lens, but you really want to aim for something that is low of f-stop, a wide of aperture as you can possibly afford. It's going to be a huge improvement. You'll thank me later. We'll talk a little bit more about aperture and the amount of light and the benefits and things like that in just a minute. But right now we're just breaking down the basics between the two. Now here lately, lens manufacturers and camera manufacturers have been coming out with a lot of very odd focal lengths, like a 35 to 150 or a 28 to 400. You know, like that used to be unheard of. But nowadays with software and lens corrections and profile corrections, they're able to do that because it's correcting automatically in your editing software. But for the most part, what they call the Holy Trinity, which is the three lenses that you would use to get basically every focal length that you would need in photography, is the 16 to 35, the 24 to 70, and the 70 to 200. Now the 16 to 35 is on the camera right now, but between these three lenses, that should give you every focal length you need to accomplish whatever shot that you're after. Whether it's landscape, whether it's real estate, or doing portraits, those three lenses should cover everything you need. And there'll be a constant aperture so you can get the most light that's possible passing through. Now, unless you're getting into sports or wildlife, then you're probably going to want something that's a little bit further out, like a 100 to 400, a 200 to 500. I think Canon just came out with that 200 to 800. That's got a very small aperture, but a very long reach. Now, I did end up getting that 100 to 400 just for sports photography. I've done a little bit of wildlife with it, but the variable aperture made it kind of hard to get the high shutter speeds you need to freeze that action when it comes to runners running bases or swinging the bat or golf clubs or things like that. So I find that the 2.8 70 to 200 was more than enough lens for most shots I was trying to achieve. Now I want to talk about prime lenses, but I want to show you something. So this is the Canon 50mm 1.8. They call this the Nifty 50. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's more affordable because it's less complicated. There's a whole lot less things in there moving around. There's not a bunch of elements and groups of elements having to move to accommodate for focal lengths and focus and less motors. It's just smaller, it's lighter, and since it's less complicated, it's more affordable. I think that everyone should have a Nifty 50 in their kit, no matter what camera brand you shoot with, whether it's Canon, Nikon, Sony. Every manufacturer makes a 50mm 1.8 that's affordable that you can keep in your kit. Believe it or not, this actually puts out pretty good results. It's slow to focus, it's noisy, but it delivers a really good image. But that's not what I wanted to show you. So this is Tamron's 45mm 1.8. Now this lens is the same aperture. This is a 1.8, this is a 1.8. But this lens has image stabilization. It has weather sealing. And look at the difference between the sizes. Once you start adding complications in there like optical image stabilization, things start getting bigger and they're not as light and as compact anymore. So that's kind of a good comparison to zoom lenses. So zoom lenses have a ton of elements in there that have to move back and forth. There's motors that that help it focus. So when you simplify things, they become more affordable, but they also can be more optimized for image quality. Here's a good example. Take iPhone, for example. Apps that work on iPhone work really, really well. Well, because the app developer that made that app for iPhone only had to make it for one iPhone. And app developers that make apps for Android have to make that app work on hundreds of phones versus just one. So they tend to be a little bit more buggy or glitchy or have problems. Well, the same thing applies to these lenses. They only have to optimize them for one focal length so they can really dial in the focus and really dial in the optics versus a zoom lens that's going to be changing focal lengths and have to focus at 35 and focus at 50 and focus at 70. It's just less complicated. So they're lighter, they're more affordable, and used to be the image quality was a whole lot better, but nowadays with technology and zoom lenses are just as sharp as primes. But once upon a time, prime lenses were way more sharp than zoom lenses. Now there is one aspect to prime lenses I think is at least worth touching on, and that's macro. For example, this is a 90mm macro. This is a prime lens with a 90mm focal length, but it's macro, which means it's made to focus super closely. And it also has a magnification to it. So every macro lens is kind of different. Some of them have a 1:2 magnification. Some of them are just 1:1. I believe this is 1:1, but it has a super close focusing distance. I think it's 0.3 meters with a 90mm focal length. That's pretty close. This lens has shot 100% of the B-roll for this channel. And macro photography is actually really, really cool. I don't know if you've ever seen like where they do super close-up shots of bugs, insects, things like that. It's pretty neat. I don't know of too many zoom lenses that have a macro capability. I think Sigma used to make some. I think their old 70-200 was a macro lens. I think maybe the Tamron was too, but I don't know of Canon making any macro zoom lenses. I know they make the 35 that's a macro, and they make the 100mm macro. But macro is basically they with a magnification and super close focusing. Now let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of zooms versus primes. So a zoom lens, one of the advantages is just like it sounds, the ability to zoom between 24 and 70 or 16 and 35 or 100 to 400 without ever having to change lenses. Now some of the disadvantages are they're bigger, they're heavier, they're more expensive, and the maximum aperture you're going to be able to get out of it is a 2.8, with the exception of a couple new lenses that were just released. Sony and Canon both have a 28-70 that's an f2, but that is an incredibly expensive lens. I think they're both like $3,000. That's just a lot of money. Now, if you're a working professional, one, you're probably not watching this video, and two, you're going to be able to write it off on your taxes. It's totally worth it. Go ahead and spend it, buy them up. Now, if you're a hobbyist or just starting out, which I feel like most people watching this video probably are, then no, you can't justify spending $3,000 on a lens. That lens is not going to pay off. It's going to be more of a liability than an asset. So for now, you just got to, buy what you can afford and get the best thing that you can get with the money that you're spending. And that's kind of where I've always stood in all this, is like there is a line where you don't have to spend a ton of money and you still get great results. And while we're talking about that, if you notice, all my lenses are Tamron lenses, except for this bad boy. That's still a Tamron, by the way. But Tamron is a great third-party lens company. They're such a great company that Sony owns 20% stake in Tamron. And most Nikon lenses are rebranded Tamron lenses. That says a lot right there. I've been using them a long time, and I've never, not once, had anybody come up to me and say, that lens doesn't look like a professional lens. I mean, you show up with that attached to your camera, people don't know the difference. It's a nice lens. The image quality is great. The image stabilization is great. I'm a huge fan. And look at this. Every one of them, rubber gasket. They're weather sealed. The affordable lenses from Canon are not weather sealed or image stabilized. Anyway, I'm rambling on. Prime lenses, the advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are they're smaller, they're more affordable, they're lighter, for the most part, better image quality, and you get a wider or faster aperture. Disadvantages is you got to move around a little bit. You're not going to be able to just stand in one spot and punch in and get the shots you want. But that's a good thing. That forces you to be more creative. And ultimately, that's why I made the decision that I did to switch to only prime lenses, because it made me think about the shot more. It just, I don't know, it made me be more creative. You can't just stand in one spot, punch in, punch out. You actually have to move your feet. You have to move around and find the shot that you're trying to get. Over the years, after talking to a lot of photographers, especially the older ones that's been doing it for a long time, they all started out on zoom lenses, just like I did, just like you probably did. Most of us do. But they eventually migrated over to shooting only on primes, and I totally get it now. Like, I see it. After using nothing but primes for a year, I totally understand. My bag is lighter. These take up less space. It's like the more you do it, the less gear you have to take to a photo shoot. I remember the first few times that I did like an actual real photo session, man, I nearly took everything I had. I'm talking about bags of gear. And now I can take a little like shoulder bag with a couple lenses in it and get exactly what I'm looking for. So I that's probably one of the biggest advantages that I see, is just being able to travel lighter. Being able to take an 85 and a 50 or a 35, or in my case, I went with the 45 because it's in between the 35 and the 50. Just less gear, less to worry about, less to think about. You can focus on the image when you're not having to make all these choices of, should I use 50 or should I use 70? Just put the 45 on there and go take some photos. It takes a lot of the calculations out to where you can just focus on the photo you're trying to take. All right, before we wrap it up, I do want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about aperture, because I said that's one of the bigger benefits of using a prime over a zoom. So let's take this 85mm 1.8. Now, 1.8 does not sound like that much more of an advantage over a 2.8, right? Wrong. A 1.8 will let in nearly twice as much light as a 2.8. And that's the whole idea with photography. I mean, that's a significant improvement. So with more light, you have more contrast, you have more color, you have less noise, and you're able to increase your shutter speed to where you get a sharper photo. But that's not the only advantage to having a faster aperture. One huge one is the ability to isolate your subject in the frame by having that super blurry, out of focus background and foreground. It really makes your subject stand out and pop. I mean, just look at these last few that I've taken with this 85. You can see where the background is just completely blown out and really isolates the subject. That's why this lens has been my favorite. And especially this 45. This 45 just has a softness to it that's almost like a bloom filter. Like, it just really doesn't look over processed. I love this lens so much. I think this thing is like from the mid 2000s. It's not new at all. It's an EF mount. I have to adapt it. I just love the overall look of it. And I love the overall look of the blurry background when it came to this 85. If I could only have one kit for the rest of my life, it would probably be these two lenses, the 85 and the 45, or I guess it would be a 50. It just depends on what you're shooting. But look how much room this takes up. I mean, that's literally nothing. Between that and your camera, you can have a very small bag, very small footprint. It's just great for my type of photography. Now, If you're shooting landscapes, then wide aperture isn't going to do you any good because you're going to stop down to f8, f9, f11. If you're doing automotive, then you're going to need an f4. If you're doing group shots, and you're going to be 5.6 to 8. You know, for portraits and headshots and things like that, the wider the aperture, the better. But it's just all about what type of photography you're going after. All right, well, that's going to do it for this one. I really do appreciate each and every one of y'all. The fact that you take time to watch these videos really does mean the world to me. And I just want to say this. Don't get caught up in the latest and greatest and, you know, seeing all these videos on YouTube. It's super easy to get caught up in, I need this, I need that. Ooh, so-and-so got this, or look at this new that. You don't have to have the latest and greatest to capture great photography. Matter of fact, there was a recent photo competition that had a $250,000 prize, and the winner was on a Canon 5D Mark II. What's that, like an early 2000s model camera? You don't need the latest and greatest. Don't fall for all the YouTube hype. Hopefully you found this helpful or useful or entertaining or all of the above. And if you did, be sure to hit the like button. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Take care of yourselves. You know you deserve it. I'm Donnie B, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.